So Father David told me that to keep the worship gig, I had to preach at least once this year, so here I am. Catherine, you'll be up next. In all seriousness, though, David continues to encourage me, sometimes prod, might be a better word, to use my training, and so I'm grateful to speak with you all today. When I was a senior in college, something extraordinary happened on the campus of Valdosta State University. It started with a fellow classmate in the English program who had recently left his fundamentalist Christian background and had become an outspoken, and for what it's worth, a very persuasive atheist. He had a lot of charisma, was great with language, he was an English major, and he was passionate about religious discussion. So he did what a lot of people did at that time, and he started a Facebook discussion group. And he called it the Atheists, Agnostics, and Freethinkers Group. Now, a better name for it at the time would probably have been the Epic Christian Beatdown Group. It got ugly. In this group, the atheists and the skeptics would wage intellectual war against a group of evangelical Christians, and usually we did not often win that war. Now, this is not the extraordinary part, okay? This is just good old-fashioned Facebook debate. And I'm not on Facebook anymore, but I hear the debates are still pretty wild out there. Is that true? But here's the extraordinary part. This classmate wasn't satisfied with a Facebook group, so he petitioned to form an official organization on campus, and he was approved. And so the Atheists, Agnostics, and Freethinkers Club was formed. And it was at this point that a really cool thing began to happen. People of various beliefs and backgrounds began to have some real conversations with each other. Now, the debating, it didn't completely stop, but when you begin to talk to people face to face, something happens. All of a sudden, we found ourselves dialoguing at times, sharing stories, even forming some friendships. I still have some friends to this day as a result of this time on campus. One of the most interesting experiences I had is talking with a Wiccan, right? A person who practices a form of what we might call pagan witchcraft. Now, this is not the stuff of Harry Potter, don't worry, but it was interesting. It was interesting to talk to this person and try to understand how they came to these particular beliefs. As I said, it was an extraordinary time in the religious life on our campus and in my life. But there's a risk of opening yourself up to dialogue with people of different religious backgrounds. And for the first time in my young life, I began to counter objections to my faith that I didn't have answers for. And I can recall sitting in my room one night, overwhelmed with plaguing doubts, questions that just didn't have answers at that moment. And I heard myself say this, "Oh my God, I don't believe anymore." Now, it's interesting that even in confessing my unbelief, I was acknowledging God. But leaving that aside, this was one of the most agonizing moments of my entire life. My faith had unraveled. I'd been a Christian my entire life, and it felt genuinely like somebody had died. So I want to pause here, but I'll return and conclude this story in a bit. Today we're talking about what it means to love the Lord with all of our minds. Now, one simple way of answering this is just to look at our passage in Romans, right? Paul reiterates what Jesus commands us by telling us to present our entire bodies, our hearts, our souls, our minds, our strength, as a spiritual act of worship. And one of the ways we do this is to renew our minds. But what does that mean? What does it mean to renew our minds? Well, if we look at other places in Paul's letters, we see him say things like this. He says, "Have the mind that's in Christ Jesus." In Philippians, he says, "Meditate. Think upon those things that are true, honorable, just, lovely, commendable." And in Colossians, he says, "Set your mind on things above where Christ is, and not on things that are on earth." Paul might put it like this in the 21st century. Think about what you think about. Think about what you think about. So I want to ask us a few questions this morning. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but have an honest self-checkup. How much of our mental energy is devoted to God or to the things of God each day? How much are we mentally aware of His presence around us? How much time do we spend blessing others with mental praying? How much time in each day are we invoking His presence in our daily tasks? Look, I'll be honest with you, I'm ADHD. I know this because, like any reasonable American, I have gone to WebMD and diagnosed myself. Sorry to the doctors out there. But seriously, my mind, just being honest, my mind is pretty scattered throughout the day. And if I'm being honest with you, God and His presence, His will, His desires can often be absent from my thinking. It's not that my thinking is necessarily focused on negative or ungodly things, although I'm sure I'm guilty just like all of us. It's just that I'm on autopilot. I get busy. I get focused on other things, the immediate tasks at hand. I get distracted. I want to check out at the end of the day. I want to watch Netflix. And before I know it, I can go a whole day without ever having thought of God or of His presence or of His desires. But certainly, God wants more for us than that, right? The mind, our thoughts, our mental pictures, our imaginings, I want to say that I think they are ground zero for our relationship with God. They are largely where our interaction with the Lord begins. And it's going to be hard for God to have access to our hearts, as Father David talked about, or to our souls, the you-ness of you, as Chris talked about last week, or even to our bodies, if He does not have access to our mental lives. Think about what you think about. It will probably give you some sense of the health of your relationship with the Lord. As I was thinking about this talk over the past few weeks, I was reminded of a couple of spiritual practices that I've done in the past that helped me tremendously in renewing my mind daily. And I want to bring them back into my own life, and I also want to offer them to you as a couple of practical ways that we can begin meditating on God and on the things of God. First, engage in the practice of the mental blessing of others. Okay, I'll explain that. So as a teacher, I can get really frustrated with my students. And before I know it, in my mind, I'm tearing them down. I'm telling myself how much they annoy me. You might be surprised, but we teachers can get pretty annoyed with our students. And if I'm not careful, that can lead to some serious complaining with my colleagues, and it can cascade into a pretty downward path. And that's not the mind of Christ. But there have been times as I'm walking down the hallways that as I would pass by a student, I will just simply offer up a simple prayer. Just so simple. You're walking down the hall, I see a student, and I say, God bless so-and-so. Let them be filled with your presence today. Redeem them. If you were to make that a practice, a great deal of your mental space would be filled up with prayer and blessing. It would be filled up with the fullness of God's desires, right? Can you imagine the impact not only on your spiritual life, but to our communities, if that was the daily practice of every Christian believer, if all the time we were blessing as we saw people? Don't even have to say anything to them. We just offered up mental prayers of thanksgiving for them. Second, practice the presence of God. Okay? This phrase, the practice of the presence of God, was coined by a 17th century monk named Brother Lawrence. And Brother Lawrence made it his aim that in every task of his day, whether it was chopping onions or mopping the floor of the monastery, that he would seek to be aware of God's constant presence and to conversate regularly with the Lord. Now, this can be hard at first, right? This is hard. This is a hard practice. So one way to begin this practice is to use the hours of the day. Most of us wear some type of smartwatch or we have our iPhones. And so here's a way to begin this. At the beginning of each hour, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, just pause for a moment and remind yourself that God's presence is with you. That's it. You just become aware once again of his presence. Say a quick prayer of thanksgiving. Ask him to remain with you throughout the hour. And I think as we do this, I believe these two practices would be a strong beginning to offering our minds daily to the Lord. But there's a second way that we might understand what it means to love the Lord with all your mind. And it's this way that I want to spend the rest of my time discussing because I'm indebted to it for saving my faith. Okay? So throughout the history of the church, up to the 21st century, and even into 2020, there have been countless individuals who have taken this statement to love the Lord with all of your minds as a calling to offer their intellects for both the advancement of our faith and for the betterment of our world. They didn't see a divide between faith and reason. Rather, they saw Jesus calling us to use our minds for the glory of God. The idea of a blind, irrational, ignorant faith was foreign to these individuals. And so I want to discuss two fields in which Christians have advanced our faith and our world through their intellectual callings. And mainly this is just to be an encouragement to you guys, just to encourage you that we have a strong intellectual heritage to our faith. I was going to talk about three, but David has really spoiled us with giving great but brief sermons. Did you guys know that he averages about 22 minutes per sermon? That's phenomenal, isn't it? I'm sure all of us can recall a time when we've been in 50-minute, hour-long sermons. And so David has spoiled us. And so I'm not going to talk about the third area. I was going to talk about kind of just my confidence in the documents of the New Testament because of the scholarship that Christians have done. But Liam's has happy hour Monday through Saturday, and so if you want to grab a beer and we can talk about that on our own time, I'd be glad to do that.
Do Alpha in the fall.
Sounds good. Okay, first the field of philosophy. Try to hang with me here. I'm going to try to go slow, and yeah, it'll be okay. In the 1950s, atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie proposed what has come to be known as the logical problem of evil. In short, he argued with considerable force that belief in the kind of God that Christians believe in doesn't simply just lack evidence, but is positively irrational. In his words, and I quote, "It can be shown not that religious belief lacks rational support, but that they are positively irrational, that the several parts of the essential theological doctrine are inconsistent with one another." Now, the problem of evil has been around for thousands of years. This is not a new problem. But what Mackie did was to try to present it in a way that showed that belief in an all-good, all-powerful God and the belief that there's evil in the world are logically contradictory beliefs. Okay? And that's a bold claim. We obviously cannot deny the presence of evil in the world, and so according to Mackie, so much for belief in God. Okay? Now, if true, I need to tell you, if he were to succeed in this, this would be utterly damning for Christian belief. It's pretty acceptable to have mystery in our faith. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly acceptable not to have answers to everything. But if it could be demonstrated that belief in God is utterly irrational, then we are in a heap of trouble, okay? It would be kind of like the belief that square circles can exist. Try to believe that for a moment. Try to believe that square circles can exist. Or try to believe that married bachelors can exist. Your minds can't do it. They're logically incompatible, right? That's just nonsense. And so I think that any reasonable person would have to give up any belief that is utterly nonsensical. And so this was a devastating criticism of Christian belief in the 1950s. However, in 1977, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga wrote his enormously famous rebuttal to Mackey called the free will defense. Okay? Now, I won't bore you with all the details. It's a very technical essay. But in short, he essentially argued that a world containing free creatures is more valuable than a world containing automatons. And while God could create a world containing free creatures like you and I, he cannot create them and simultaneously determine them to do only what is right. For then they are not actually free. And so it would be, once again, like the creation of a square circle. That would be nonsense. And so he sought to show that there's no logical inconsistency between belief in God and the acknowledgement of evil, because if there are free creatures, they may at times go wrong. They may at times do evil. And so there wouldn't be any inconsistency. Now, there's a whole lot more to that argument. But what I want to say to you, and this is the point, as a result of Plantinga's work, of his giving his mind to the defense of our faith, it is almost universally conceded now among philosophers that Plantinga has successfully defeated the logical problem of evil. That's enormous, guys. That's enormous. That is a huge moment in the history of philosophy for us. Prominent atheist philosopher William Rowe has said, the logical problem of evil has been severely diminished, if not entirely resolved, as a result of Plantinga's work. It's pretty cool. Because of Plantinga's commitment to the intellectual call to love the Lord with all of our minds, you and I cannot be charged, at least so far as the problem of evil is concerned, with believing in something that is illogical and irrational. We are perfectly entitled to maintain a faith in God and believe that it's a reasonable thing to do so. Now, I don't want to overstate my case, so let me be clear. The problem of evil is still far and away the most significant objection to belief in God. It is still a very, very difficult question. There will probably never be a slam dunk response to it by theists. I just don't think that's possible. But these objections are raised far more modestly now in philosophical literature. They do not try to present a logical objection. And so you and I, because of the work of Plantinga, are justified in maintaining a faith in God, even while acknowledging that there's evil in the world. That's really cool. Second is the field of science, okay? A common narrative today goes something like this. You've heard it. Science has buried God. Or, it's impossible to believe in God in the age of science. Or, science has shown faith in God to be irrational and ignorant. Have you all heard something like that? My students, I hear my students say it at times. World-renowned theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, he put it like this. He said, there is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. Here Hawking seems to suggest that science and faith are completely at odds with each other. One is reasonable, the other is irrational. One has evidence, the other does not. One works, one fails. But I want to tell you today, this is good news, the data simply does not bear that conclusion out. If this narrative were true, we would expect to see almost no believing scientist in the scientific community. After all, we regard scientists as some of our best thinkers, people who are guided by evidence and rationality. So what are the numbers? Well, it is true, it is true that the scientific community is generally less religious than the public itself. But I'm not sure how much stock to put into that, because if you look at polls about Americans score very high on the question of belief in God, right? It's just an extraordinarily high number. And you just have to wonder, to what extent does that hold true in all cases? But even if we acknowledge that, it's not nearly as bleak as the common narrative suggests. According to several large recent studies, the number of scientists who are religious stands at about 50%. 50%. And the number of scientists who specifically believe in God stands at around 40%. That is almost half, guys, almost half of the scientific community feels that it is perfectly compatible to follow the findings of science and to be driven by evidence and also to believe in God. There is no conflict for them. Even more interesting to me is that in the 20th century, the number of Nobel Prize winners, those doing, in my view, the best science out there, who believed in God was actually much higher than 50%. Some estimates, there have been studies that show that the number of chemistry Nobel Prize winners and the number of Nobel Prize winners in physics are actually closer to 65 to 70% in the 20th century. So, what do these scientists say about the nature of their science and the nature of their faith? I could literally read you hundreds of quotes. I won't do that, but for time's sake, allow me to read two, okay? Max Planck is considered the father of modern physics. He formulated one of the most important physical theories in the 20th century, quantum theory. After Einstein, he is probably considered the most influential physicist of modern times. I want you to listen to what he said about faith and his science. Both religion and science need for their activities the belief in God. The one does not exclude the other. Rather, they are complementary and mutually interacting. Man needs science as a tool of perception. He needs religion as a guide to action. For Planck, God as the creator of an orderly, intelligible universe is the very basis for doing science. That in doing science, we are, in a sense, simply discovering the creation that God has bestowed upon us. And Planck embraced the call to love God with all his mind. Let's move into the 21st century. Ian Hutchinson is a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. And if anyone knows anything about MIT, it is by far and away the most prestigious technical institution in the world. These guys are supposed to be really smart. Listen to what he says about how his faith informs his science. This is going to be a larger quote. There is no different Christian way to conduct an experiment or to solve a differential equation. However, when I consider the subtle, elegant coherence and the majestic grandeur of the natural world, I do feel enormously privileged to be able to see and to understand some of the wisdom and plan of the Creator. I'm also happy that, in part by conscious choice motivated by my faith, I have worked on subjects that have the potential to provide great benefits to humankind. For Hutchinson, science again leads him not away from God, but to him. And his faith has led him to serve the world for its betterment. Hutchinson embraced the call to love the Lord with all of his mind. And so I'm incredibly grateful for these scientists, and there's many of them out there who have used their intellects to serve God. For they've shown me that there doesn't need to be any conflict between my faith and the scientific picture of the world. And that's encouraging to me, because the scientific picture of the world is amazing. It's absolutely spectacular in what it's done. I don't think we need to try to be in direct conflict with it. What I realize is that there doesn't need to be any conflict. So back to my story. After a long and agonizing night, I got up the next morning. I felt like a train had hit me. And I fell on my knees and I said the following prayer: God, if you exist, help my unbelief. And that was it. That was all I could say. But over the next weeks and months, I began a journey to find answers. And it took time. But what I found is some of what I've shared with you today. I found philosophers who could answer many of those hard questions. I found scientists who showed me how to be a thinking person and a person of faith. I found theologians and historians that gave me confidence in the reliability of the New Testament. We need to do a sermon on that sometime. It's good info. I'm grateful to these men and women who embrace the call to love the Lord with their intellects, because in doing so, God used them to restore my faith. And so let me end with just a few brief challenges for us. The first one is for all of us. Let's offer God our mental activities throughout the day. Let's awaken to his presence that's with us every moment. Let's bless others with prayers as we pass them by. Next, maybe there are people in here who struggle intellectually in their faith. I don't think I'm the only one. And I just want to say to you, I totally get it. I respect that journey. I respect the difficulties of that journey. There's no judgment here from me. But I would say to you, keep seeking. Keep searching. Because of these people who have chosen to serve God with their minds, I have found good answers to most of these questions. And finally, let's be a community that does not shy away from intellectual challenges to our faith. The world, our youth, ladies and gentlemen, there is a war being waged over the minds of our youth. I can't overstate that. And our friends need Christians who are not scared of difficult questions, but who will thoughtfully wrestle with them and through them in a friendly way, in a way that's not combative. They need us to love the Lord with all of our minds. Amen.